Let me give you a couple of examples out of my experience as members of boards. This goes back before my days at the SEC, I grant you. I don't think the world has changed that dramatically in the passage of time. I was privileged to serve on the board of a chemical company. Got a call one day, I was on the audit committee, say the flap between the management and the auditors on how to account for earnings. We had a meeting of the audit committee and decided with the auditors. But that wasn't the important point. The important point was what surfaced as the management's attitude towards earnings and how one goes about identifying them, let alone accounting for them. I resigned at the next board meeting. A year later, obviously, shareholder suit and all that goes with that. I was privileged to be on the board of a major insurance company. I was invited on the board because a close friend of mine had a major investment in the company, having merged his company into it. I think it was about the third meeting. It was an agenda item. It said report on acquisition. This was a report a year after the acquisition on how well the acquisition had gone. I thought, well, this is great. This is a really progressive company, a responsible company, accounting for the decision they made to make an acquisition. I sat through about a 20-minute presentation, and I waited for questions from my fellow directors. And there weren't any. So I finally said, you know, I'm new to this board. I've got a pretty good accounting background. And I think I even understand something about insurance company accounting. But I got to tell you, I didn't understand anything you said. To which the board members were on big smiles, shaking their heads. I said, where the hell were you? I could go on. It was that kind of set of experiences, and I'm sure they're not strange to some of you. Because what happens in corporate boards, you're invited, at least then primarily by the CEO, now maybe by a so-called independent nominating committee, to join the club. And no one wants to be the skunk at the picnic. And over any time, basically, you tend to get co-opted by your environment. And it's just human nature. Okay, let me switch. In 1978, Arthur Andersen already had more than 50% of their revenues from non-audit services, and a larger percentage of their profitability. 1978. And they were lowballing audit fees to get non-audit services. Now, where over time was that likely to take the profession? We held a hearing when I was at the SEC with institutional investors. The hearing wasn't on the issue that I raised with them, but I saw an opportunity and I raised it. The number 2 man for one of the largest investment management companies at that time was there, and I said, hey, do you always vote your proxies with management? And they said, yeah, basically we do. I said, why? They can't do everything right. And his answer stopped, and usually go to the second question. This is one time when I didn't have a second question. His answer was, we don't know enough about the company. So how the hell can you invest in it if you don't know enough about the company to take a position on proxy issues? Well, I am not a fan of legislation. I talked, as a result of my experiences and what my concern about where the profession was going. I talked with leaders of the accounting more about a substantive peer review program, they came up with one that was rinky-dink. And I told them, you're going to hang yourselves. I taught that every January there's a meeting of the securities lawyers in San Diego. And I spent each of my 4 years as chairman talking to that group about the future. And I said, if the private sector doesn't clean up its act, there's going to be legislation. I don't believe in legislation, but you're going to bring it on yourselves. The position I took may be somewhat extreme, but I said the CEO should not be chairman of the board because the chairman controls the agenda. And you need somebody as chairman that doesn't control the agenda, that can put things on the agenda that need to be on there, or even I've seen CEOs, they place it on the agenda, but they place it at the end of the agenda when half the board has had to leave to catch a plane. Or you're out of time, we'll discuss it next meeting, and you never get to that discussion at the next meeting. And I said the CEO should be the only insider on the board. All the others ought to be outsiders. That means no suppliers, no people with any conceivable appearance of conflict. Now, you can't legislate independence. Independence is a state of mind. And it's a psychological independence we're talking about. It's the ability to raise questions and raise issues when they need to be raised. All legislation or regulation can do is try to identify those places where there's an appearance of conflict with independence, like being a major supplier or being the wife of the chief executive or whatever. I mean, things that are pretty obvious. But again, you can't legislate independence, and there's no way to do it. After I made a couple of my speeches, next thing I knew, there was a Senate proposed that piece of legislation by Senator Metzenbaum of Ohio entitled Shareholder Rights Act. And he called me as the first witness. And I testified against the act. And afterwards he said, Harold, what are you doing? All I was trying to do is put into legislation what you've been talking about. I said, I don't believe doing it by legislation. Eventually, if the private sector doesn't clean up its own act, that'll happen. Now, if we can jump forward, you know what's all that transpired in the meantime. In a sense, we come to Sarbanes-Oxley. And to me, Sarbanes-Oxley was a logical consequence of what happened with corporate governance, with the accounting profession, and with institutional investors. It happened because of the people in the private sector. And actually, Paul Sarbanes is a close personal friend. He's one of the few people in Congress who remained a friend after I left the commission. And Paul called and asked me for some advice on the drafting of the legislation. And I agreed to help him with it. But I must tell you that despite Enron, Sarbanes-Oxley as a piece of legislation was dead until WorldCom happened. And when WorldCom happened, it was all over. All the legislators had to fall in place. They couldn't resist it any longer. But again, it came out of the private sector. You might say a couple of bad apples, but that's the question. That's the question we all have to look at. When you look at the content of Sarbanes-Oxley, and I know you've got some interest in it, particularly in 404. But what Sarbanes-Oxley really has endeavored to put in place is a different structure. And I described this structure this way. It's that the audit firms report to the audit committee, trying to draw some separation between the management and the auditors, so that the auditors don't, in a sense, appear to be beholden to management. It doesn't completely solve the problem, because to some extent they're still going to feel beholden to management. And there's going to be enormous pressure on the accounting firms to hold on to their clients. And with the failure of Arthur Andersen, you've got an oligopoly here, where they can raise their fees, and where it's difficult to move from one accounting firm to another. There are conflicts and everything else. But But that's where the audit committee has to assume its role very aggressively. But then there's something else in place which I think is very critical, and that's part of Sarbanes-Oxley, and that's the Public Accounting Oversight Board. Because the real responsibility of that board, as far as I'm concerned, is through its own audit process to oversee the work of the auditors. And what I mean by that is to provide backbone to the auditors, to be able to say no to management, because they're going to be reviewed by the oversight board, and they don't want to be criticized by the oversight board. And the oversight board so far has been quite critical in a number of cases of what the accounting firms have done. But I think that's an important piece of discipline. The only other alternative, which won't happen, absent another set of disasters, is that in some fashion the accounting firms draw their revenues from the government, in some fashion, not from the companies. I'm not saying it can't happen. I don't want it to happen. But it could over time, just as Sarbanes-Oxley happened over time. Now, we're also seeing much more aggressiveness on the part of institutional investors. Now, according to the New York Stock Exchange survey, 63% of the outstanding value of publicly traded securities is owned by institutional investors. Now, that tells us two things. It tells us at this point that the individual investor is increasingly out of the picture. And I think part of that is a reflection of some concerns about the very issues we've been talking about. Some of it is they got burned in the dot-com bust, and they're not prepared to try to take another ride. But the institutional investors are becoming alive. They still have a ways to go. The most prominent institutional investors that are active today are pension funds. And many of those are union pension funds. Now, you can worry about unions getting too much power, and that's can be a legitimate concern. But on the other hand, they are very aggressive, and the issue that's been prominent the last 2 years has been the so-called majority vote issue. And there are actually two kinds of developments in that area. The one that's so-called, I guess the Intel, they call it the Intel Initiative, which is the stronger of the two, says that if a director does not get a majority of the votes voting at the meeting, then within 90 days the board has to decide whether to remove that director or continue. And the pressure is very strong at that point for the board to respond and remove the director. The more modest one, which is the Pfizer Initiative, so-called, says that if more than half of the voters of the votes actually withhold votes from that director, it's a little more modest recommendation, then again the board will decide within 90 days whether to move. But the important point is institutional investors are becoming more aggressive in taking stands on issues relating to boards of directors. The emerging next issue, of course, is going to be executive compensation. Now, the concept that says that executives are being paid according to the market is BS. Plain and simple. I mean, are you going to turn to your chief executive and say, you're not better than average? But if everybody's better than average, what happens to average? It keeps going up. And whereas not too many years ago, I've got the data here. If I can find it quickly, I'll refer to it. There's studies being done now. The S&P 500 in 2000, CEO compensation was 400 times the average worker's compensation. In 1992, it was 80 times. Now, don't tell me CEOs have gotten that much better, 5 times better in 8 years. Now, maybe it's more difficult to be CEO today than it was 8 years. That's 16 years ago now, or 14 years ago. But something's out of whack. And in an era where corporations, for very understandable reasons, are switching from defined benefit pension plans to defined contribution plans, where they're cutting back on health coverage, and where there is concern about out-farming of jobs overseas, the whole relationship, not only between employee and employer, but between society and employers, I think is somewhat in jeopardy. I don't think corporations today get the kind of credit for the good they do that they deserve. I think there's a broad suspicion and lack of public support. And in that kind of environment, anything can happen. I hope it doesn't. I don't want it to. But things are out of whack. As I say, I think the move by institutional investors is a positive move. But I think other things have got to happen as well. I think we're moving in the right direction. Now, 404 is a very popular and disturbing issue. And it probably will be for many of you in this room. If you don't know what 404 is, you'll learn about it in the course of the seminar. But the point of 404 it relates to internal controls. And I guess the most controversial or troublesome part of it is the requirement that the auditors opine on the internal controls. Now, you can look at it several ways. If your internal controls were great, what's the big deal? I think a part of what we're seeing in terms of the cost of implementing the internal control provision in the last several years has been, one, deferred maintenance, so-called, getting internal controls up to where they ought to be. The second I touched on a little earlier when I said the accounting firms have become an oligopoly. And to some extent, in some extent, they're short of staff, adequate staff. But on the other hand, now they've got to make their money out of the accounting side rather than the non-audit side. And as an oligopoly, they can push it. And they've got a sense of control at this point, a sense of importance, if not omnipotence, that's got to influence them to some extent. So I'm not defending the accounting firms. I think they may be overdoing it to some extent. I think that's what we have to look at. I'm hopeful that in a year, maybe by now, the deferred maintenance, the lack of adequate internal controls, regardless whether the auditors were overseeing them or not, will be behind us. And we'll see a lot of those audit fees go down. Now, there's always the issue, there is the vibrant issue right now of what to do about smaller companies. And I don't know where the commission's going to come down on it. I'm conflicted personally. There's an enormous amount of public market that's tied up in the smaller companies. I know the audit fees become a major, if not disproportionate part of the revenue stream of the companies. Yet, on the other hand, the need for good internal controls is there in any event. So the ultimate question, I think, has to be, if we're not going to require, if the commission is not going to require, and I don't know where it's going to come out, if they're not going to require auditor certification of internal controls, what's the discipline that's going to be in place within the company, within the boards, to assure that the internal controls are adequate? And that, to me, puts it right back on the board. What the hell are you going to do? I mean, if the auditors, if you're relieved of the auditor responsibility, what's left? And if if the SEC eases off on that, and then we get some busts, you know what comes next. And the number of earnings restatements, they're really quite amazing. It's an interesting barometer of what's going on in many companies, and not all the biggest ones either. So that again, I think, is something that we will have to see.